believe John has the ability to share his screen if he wants to, and take it away.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for coming. It's great to be here. I'm going to be chatting today about the running recognition algorithm that I developed for wearable accelerometer data, lovingly dubbed Carl. So I'm a PhD student at the Indiana University Biomechanics lab here, and I'm really interested in how people move when they run and how that's related to injuries. And I'm not alone in thinking that running is a pretty great way of getting physical activity. In the US, about 1 in 8 people run for exercise. And in some countries like Denmark, it's as many as 1 in 3 people. But around 20% or so, give or take, of runners get injured every year. And injuries are the #1 reason why people who are new to the sport end up leaving. So what I fundamentally went to grad school to do was to try to get underneath this problem of running injuries. I ran in college. I'm somewhere in this photo with a lot longer hair than I have right now. After college, I wrote a book about running. I started a website about running. I coached a high school team. And through all those experiences, one of the big takeaways for me was that injuries were the primary reason why most runners don't reach their potential. And so I really got interested in trying to study the biomechanics of overuse injuries in runners. And once I got to grad school, I settled pretty quickly on using wearable technology to approach that problem, because once I started collecting data in our lab, which you can see over here on the left, I started thinking like, I don't know if the way people are running down this runway is necessarily always representative of how they're moving outside in the real world. And the wearable technology offers a really nice way to capture some facets about how people move outside the lab, which is great. So that brings us to the topic of our conversation today, which is the paper I wrote about our running recognition algorithm for free living accelerometer data. And if this was a normal talk, I would be doing the usual intro, methods, results, discussion, conclusion. But since this is a slightly more casual setting, and because I've been asked to liven things up a little bit, I'm going to instead talk about this, the way these ideas came to me and the way that this project actually came about, which was not at all this very linear, like background and then hypothesis and then methods. And then it was very much a roundabout and serendipitous journey that led me to publish this paper. So I'm going to try and present how I came to this project, like chronologically. And like I said, it was kind of a serendipitous series of people and ideas that led this Carl classifier to come into existence. So it was more about who I met versus what I knew, or maybe what I thought I knew. So when I first came to IU to do my PhD, I started doing research in my advisor, Alison Gruber's lab. And she was doing these studies where she would take an actigraph, which is like a triaxial high resolution accelerometer, and stick it on the lower back of runners and have them go off and do their training. And they would keep that device with them for like their whole cross-country season or a whole 3-month training program. And this is pretty cool because you can get this high resolution, fine-grained acceleration in each plane of motion from the runner, like 100 samples a second. So you could get each of these, each of these is one step, and you can start to think about like, well, maybe we could capture information about how the person moves when they run. So when I started looking into these data, I was really excited by this prospect. But when I started looking at what it actually looks like when it comes off the actigraph, it's more like a big mess like this. So these are 24-hour days in different people's lives, and they're running somewhere in here, and we can maybe eyeball roughly where it is. But it was not nearly as easy or nice as the nice schematics like this would have made me believe. I would like to be able to analyze every step somebody takes when they're running outside the lab, but it was very daunting when faced with this. And actually, it's worse than just this picture, because if you're doing a longitudinal study, you have many people who do many runs over long periods of time. And I don't know if anybody else here has worked with actigraphs, but they don't have an off switch. So you initialize them, you give them to the subject, and they go off into the real world, and then they bring that device back a couple days or weeks, or sometimes for us months later, and then you just have like 50 gigabytes of accelerometer data. So somewhere in here are these individual running steps, but it's not at all obvious how to identify and extract just the periods you care about, and not when the device was sitting in their gym bag in the back of their car, for example. So honestly, I was pretty dejected and turned my attention the rest of that year to other things in the lab, because I just couldn't figure out a clever way to fix that problem. But one day I got an email inviting me to a seminar from someone from Johns Hopkins University by the name of Dr. Jacek Urbanek. And this wasn't even in our department or school. This was the next building over. This is the SICE, as we call it, School of Information and Computing. And the title of the talk was something human activity, health studies, wearable accelerometers. I use those. So I went to this talk, and Dr. Urbanek was showing pictures like this, which may not look super cool or clever to you, but I got really excited when I saw this, because I realized that these are individual gait cycles from walking, from accelerometer data from different parts of the body. So I got so excited about this, in fact, that I chatted with Dr. Urbanek and tried out his step segmentation method on some in-lab running data we had, where I knew it was just running and no other kinds of activity. And it worked great. It worked amazing. You get these beautiful plots like this. You can parse out each individual step into the 3 planes of motion. It was just fantastic, but it still had that original problem of like, I need to know when the person is running to go back and slice up the steps, because otherwise you just get nonsense. In the lab, you can run continuously, but out in the real world, maybe you run and you stop and wait and you cross the street and you run again and pet a cute dog or tie your shoe or get some water. And so real world runs look a lot more like this versus one uninterrupted block of running. Walking, probably like that too in the real world. So I asked Dr. Urbanek, well, what do you do? How do you know when to segment out the walking steps? And he said, oh, yes, well, it's very difficult, but I made a walking recognition algorithm. I identify when they're walking, and then I just look at those data. I thought, oh, that was a pretty cool idea. I wonder if we could do something like that with running. And the next serendipitous step that happened was that it turned out that the whole reason Dr. Urbanek was at IU giving a talk was because the last author on this paper, Jarek Herislak, was a professor and still is a professor here in biostatistics. And he does a lot of work with wearable technology, mostly for health outcomes. The whole reason Jacek Urbanek was looking at this was to try to study gait variability in people with various neurological conditions, I think, if I remember correctly. So Dr. Gruber and I met with Dr. Herislak a couple times and started chatting about how we might go about building a running detection algorithm. And he said, who you should start working with is this new postdoc I have, Marcin Strachowicz. He had done some work previously where he built a car driving detection algorithm, where it turns out if you're wearing a wearable accelerometer on your wrist and you're driving a car, the vibrations of the engine are transmitted through the car and through the steering wheel, and you can pick them up in the hand. There's just the right particular frequency that you can, with reasonable accuracy, identify when somebody's driving a car. So we all started chatting about some of the fast strategies they'd used in their previous different kind of activity recognition algorithms, tried to figure out how it might work for running. So this is the same running acceleration signal I showed you earlier. And we looked at plots like this to try to figure out, like, okay, what is it about running that is distinctive from standing, sitting, walking, driving, other kinds of typical activity, daily activities that you might do. So Marcin pointed out a couple problems right away that would make this difficult. First off, people who do research with wearable devices like to put them lots of different places on the body, put them on the wrist, on the low back, on the left hip, on the right hip, somewhere on the torso. And that's going to change how the acceleration signal manifests on the device. And not only that, but even for a given location, the orientation in space of the device is also going to change how the acceleration appears on the XYZ axes. Because even if you put on a, say, a waist strap accelerometer, like I showed you in that picture earlier, you can put it on like right side up or upside down, and that's going to change how the acceleration manifests on each of the three axes. So our solution to this was to just look at the vector magnitude or the resultant acceleration, because that gets rid of anything related to orientation. And it also has this nice property where the acceleration profiles you see in running at the waist or the chest or the hips all look very similar. And likewise at the wrist, which is another popular location for people who do physical activity research, also look pretty similar. So this is a little snippet of acceleration data from when somebody is transitioning from a run to a walk. So they're slowing down at the end of a run and then they transition to walking. So once we'd gotten over this hurdle, we started taking a closer look at the difficult edge cases, which were going to be how to distinguish very fast walking from very slow running. We honed in on two specific features that seem to be useful here. Now, these patterns, this signal on the left, this signal on the right, look pretty similar, but if you look closely, you can notice, like, first off, the running is a little bit higher amplitude. And second off, there are more steps. There are more gait cycles in this 3-second window. Instead of just 7 big bumps here for walking, there's 8 if you count them up. And of course, each of these bumps is associated with one step taken. So if we could quantify what this frequency is, we could associate that with like somebody's cadence when they're walking or when they're running. So we decided to reduce or describe individual windows of acceleration data with two features or two numbers that describe them. First, the peak-to-peak amplitude, which is like the maximum minus the minimum. And second, the dominant frequency. So we got the dominant frequency using something called the wavelet transform, which allows you to get high time resolution and good frequency resolution. And that dominant frequency, again, just kind of corresponds to the stride frequency of the person if they're walking or if they're running. Now, distinguishing running from, say, sitting in a chair or laying down in bed is really easy because the amplitude is very, very low when you're just laying down, not doing anything. But walking versus running, more tricky. So now with these two features, we can describe each individual 1-second window with just two numbers, amplitude and whatever the dominant frequency of the acceleration signal was in that window. So once we started having some notions about what to do about this, it was time to collect some real data. So we did a treadmill protocol with about 30 runners, and we had them wear accelerometers on their low back and on their wrist. And we had them do this treadmill protocol where we swept through a wide variety of speeds, and they could choose to walk or run at any speed, whichever just felt more comfortable. So we wanted to cover a wide range of speeds, but we wanted to densely sample the speeds right around the walk-run transition, which is dashed line here. It's about 4.7 miles an hour or like 2.1 meters per second for most people. So this was great, but treadmill running is not the same thing as running in the real world. So the treadmill data was great for developing the algorithm because we had standing when they were resting between segments. We had walking when they chose to walk. We had running when they chose to run. But to use this out in the real world, we wanted to validate it on real world data from brand new people our algorithm had never seen before. So we got 30 more runners, different people from the treadmill protocol. They wore the same devices in the same place, but this time they wore them for a full 24-hour day. We also gave them a GPS watch, and we trained them how to use it to time their run very carefully, where they would pause it when they would stop at a stoplight or stop across the street, then unpause it again to continue. Now, during that 24-hour day, they did one outdoor run at whatever speed they wanted on whatever course they wanted. And because there are some other types of exercise, like maybe playing soccer or ultimate frisbee, where you would be running as a part of it, we said, okay, you can go about your normal daily life, go for your run, but don't do any other running-based activities during the day. You can do other kinds of activities. You can go to the gym, you can lift weights, whatever, go for a bike ride, but just don't do any running-based activity, because that would include real running, but it would be identified as non-running. So the idea here is that the GPS watch timestamps were like a user annotated record of whether or not they were running. So we don't know what they were doing the rest of the day when the GPS watch isn't recording, but when it is recording, we know that they are running at that time. And we can check because we can look at the speed on the GPS watch, which is recorded once per second. So essentially we have this like binary yes, no vector for 24 hours of, are you running right now? Yes or no. So the real world data come out like this. This is what I showed you earlier. We have raw acceleration data, but this time we also have a binary vector saying yes or no, were you running at this time or not? So how does the Karl classifier actually work? So we baked in a few, maybe we could call them like rules or heuristics. And then there's another piece that is learned. And I'll talk about the learned aspect in a moment. But one nice thing about running is that it is a continuous activity. And generally, you don't run for half a second. So what we did was we looked for bouts of continuous high amplitude activity and flagged them as possibly running. But we set that threshold really, really, really low, right? So there'd be lots of false positives. Then once we have high amplitude and continuous periods of the accelerometer signal, then we identify, do those periods have amplitude and frequency characteristics that are consistent with running based on the treadmill data that we collected. So if you take that treadmill data and you plot each of those 1 second windows with the dominant frequency on the x-axis and the peak-to-peak amplitude on the y-axis, because remember, each 1 second window we can now describe with 2 numbers, and just make a scatter plot of them. It looks like this, where you get standing down here in gray, obviously very little peak-to-peak amplitude because you're not moving up and down or forward and backwards or left to right when you're standing still. Walking is this big cluster right here, and running is this cluster right here. Interestingly, also, as the speed increases, the amplitude and frequency increases, which makes sense, right? Because you bounce up and down more, and you increase your cadence generally when you walk or run faster. So this pattern was visible both for data collected at the torso and at the wrist. So that first amplitude threshold is shown here in the dashed red line. So we said, okay, everything below this threshold, just ignore it. It's way too low amplitude to be running. So we're not even going to bother running it through the classifier. So just ignore that. Then for the remaining data above it, we fit a logistic regression algorithm to it. So just trying to classify running, yes or no. Now, most people think about logistic regression with regards to the odds ratios that you get out of it for like statistical analysis, which is very useful. But what logistic regression is doing from a like a classification perspective is it's drawing a linear decision boundary in the data space. And in this case, we only have 2 variables. And so it's just going to draw a straight line and say everything above this boundary, that's running. Everything below this boundary, that's not running. Now, we were able to get this curved line over here by adding dominant frequency as a quadratic feature. So that's why you get a nice parabola. So really, this is just a threshold cutoff, and then logistic regression. Everything above the decision boundary is classified as running. Everything below it is classified as not running. So this is the core learned part of the Karl classifier, because this decision boundary is learned from the data. And on the in-lab data, it performs amazing. We used the accuracy metric we use is called the F1 score, which is it's like normal accuracy, and then it goes from 0 to 1, 1 being perfect, but it balances out both false positives and false negatives, and it's better when you have imbalanced amounts of data. So the accuracy on the treadmill data was fantastic, but the real question is how good does it perform in the real world? This is a step-by-step illustration of how you go from raw data collected in the real world to just the running by applying the Karl classifier's rules. So first, like I said earlier, we just completely ignore all the low amplitude stuff. So all this stuff down here, sleeping at night and whatever this is, brushing your teeth in the morning, that cannot be running. It's way too low amplitude. There's still these candidate bouts of running here, and those are the bouts that go into the logistic regression classifier. So for example, maybe this is some brisk walking, and that gets knocked out because it doesn't have amplitude and frequency characteristics that are similar enough to those seen in running. Finally, we apply the continuity rule again, because maybe this is like, I don't know, running up 1 or 2 stairs or clapping your hands once or twice. It generates a high amplitude, high frequency signal, but it isn't continuous enough. And by the way, I don't know if I mentioned this, but the continuity rule is something the researcher can set. So you can say, I only care about bouts of running that are at least 10 seconds or 30 seconds or a minute. And you can also go down as short as 3 seconds. You can say, I want to see running bouts that are 3 seconds long. So that's a nice researcher tunable parameter, because sometimes you do only care about longer bouts, but sometimes you want to get everything. So the performance in the real world data was also very good. At the torso, we got 0.984. At the wrist, 0.994. This is showing the agreement between the ground truth, which is the shaded bars down here, and the Karl classifier, which is the gray or dark blue line. Oops, so let's see the way. So this looks relatively straightforward, like you might be able to just kind of like eyeball it and say, well, above this threshold. But especially at the wrist, and especially people who are very active throughout the day, it's really hard to tell if they ran or when they ran just by looking at the signal. So for example, this person, their day looks highly active, and without an automated way of detecting running, it's a lot harder. It's very difficult to determine if they ran and when. But nevertheless, the Karl classifier does a really great job of identifying and extracting just the periods of running and not the interruptions in it. Now, when we looked at the real world validation data, there was one subject whose data were pretty significant outliers. It performed a lot worse on data from the waist, from one subject. And we were digging into why, like, why is it only at the waist? Because, she had a device on her waist, but also on her wrist. So we did some digging. We looked at the data. We reached out to the subject and said, hey, what were you up to during the afternoon? Our algorithm says you went running for 30 minutes, but you didn't record it on the watch. And she said, oh, I went to the gym and I got on the elliptical machine. And, that's not running. That's fair and totally in allowance with the protocol of the study. And when we looked at the data and when we experimented with ourselves, we got some actigraphs on and went over to the gym and got on the elliptical machine and got on the treadmill. And sure enough, it generates really similar acceleration profiles, at least from the perspective of the classifier algorithm. Whereas like you and I can look at this and see that there's a visual difference here. But remember, the algorithm only sees the peak-to-peak amplitude and the frequency. So the peak-to-peak amplitude here is about 4 Gs, and the frequency, well, there's 1, 2, 3, 4 gate cycles in 1.5 seconds, and 1, 2, 3, 4 gate cycles in 1.5 seconds. So these are almost indistinguishable from the Karl classifier's perspective. And this is the kind of algorithmic interpretability that is really useful when you have a simple model with very few features. If we'd used some really fancy black box deep learning algorithm or some like really sophisticated uninterpretable machine learning thing, we probably wouldn't be able to do this kind of analysis to figure out why did the algorithm fail in this situation, and why did it only fail for the waist and not the wrist. Well, it turns out the wrist, you are holding handles, and so it's not moving very much. So the interpretability here was a really useful thing. So seeing how well it performed in most cases in the real world from data from our lab was great. But if this is going to be useful to other researchers, really we want to do some external validation, because they might be using different devices. They might be studying different activities alongside running. They might be putting the devices at different locations. They might be using different sampling frequency. So we wanted to do an additional validation step. And in doing so, we were aided to a significant degree by many previous researchers in this field of human activity recognition who had made not only their papers, but their data sets publicly available. So we were able to get data from 166 new subjects across 8 independent data sets and use the data from those subjects to validate the performance of the model. So here's how it performs in the external validation. Pretty good, although not as good as our in-lab data. And this turns out to be a pretty common theme when you're developing a predictive model, whether it's for electrocardiograms or chest x-rays or electronic healthcare record data. You usually see a degradation in performance when you roll it out to new equipment, new labs, different populations. But having this understanding of how the model performs like in the real world is really useful and really important. Now, we did some digging into the different activities in this external validation data set to figure out what was the biggest culprit that was causing the accuracy to be lower than what we had measured in the lab. And it turned out that one type of activity that a lot of these human activity researchers study is either continuous, like vertical jumping, like jumping jacks, or jump roping. Turns out that about half the time that gets flagged as running, and the other half it gets successfully ignored. Whereas with most other types of activities, the algorithm correctly classifies them as not running, and most of the time with running for most people, it is classified correctly as running. This is a tangential point here, but I really like how this figure is a great illustration of why I think plotting your raw data in addition to your mean and confidence intervals is great, because you have an extreme bimodal distribution here with the jumping that would not show up if I just showed the box plot here. Whereas it's not like it's getting 50% all the time. It's like half the time getting 100% and half the time getting 0%. But again, if you think about the interpretability here, it makes sense why jumping or jump roping or jumping jacks would generate amplitude and frequency characteristics that would get picked up as if they were running. Whereas like cycling or shooting basketballs or kicking soccer balls would not generate those same amplitude and frequency characteristics. And so that probably explains why they're getting correctly classified as not running. So looking forward to future applications, some areas that I'm hoping that other people will use this for include really large scale physical activity epidemiology research. There is a study called the UK Biobank study, which you might be familiar with, which collected a huge number of health-related variables and health outcomes on people in the United Kingdom. And that includes 100,000 of them who wore a wrist-worn physical activity monitor collecting raw accelerometry data for a full week. So if 100,000 people did that, figure maybe, I don't know, several thousand of them went running during that time. So activity-specific recognition algorithms like this open up the possibility to do activity-specific subcohorts. So what about every runner in the UK Biobank study, for example? I think this might also be useful for people researching energy expenditure during exercise, because if you know that somebody's running, you can probably make a more accurate prediction about what their energy expenditure is versus what people traditionally do, which is they just look at the raw activity counts from the device and try and estimate their energy expenditure that way. And then one thing that I'm very interested in, of course, is using this to study people's injury risk through studying their biomechanics when they're out in the real world. So my goal was to make a really simple run detection algorithm that takes raw acceleration data as input and spits out when are they running, yes or no. And that's, after a long journey, that is what I did. There's a demo of how to use the Carl classifier on my GitHub, and this is essentially the gist of it. You load in your data, you grab the vector magnitude of the acceleration data, and then that goes into the Carl classifier, and out comes a binary vector of zeros and ones showing either 0, no, the person was not running at this time, or 1, the person was running at this time. So what were the lessons that I learned in this? First off, there's a lot of people in different fields of research that run into similar or exactly the same problems. Jacek Urbanek was interested in gait patterns in people with a neurological disease, but he developed an activity recognition algorithm and a step segmentation algorithm. Marcin was interested in sedentary time, and he wanted to detect when people were driving a car, but that was also an activity recognition problem. And they had really great ideas that were super useful and way better than what I would have been able to come up with just thinking through this problem on my own. Second, we saw several instances in this project where having a model that was interpretable was really useful because we could understand why it failed or why it performed unexpectedly. There is a lot to be said for the use of black box machine learning algorithms in some cases, but I think maybe simple interpretable models don't quite get enough love because they do have some significant benefits. Going along with that point, I learned a lot of the development of this project came out of looking at the outliers and looking at the cases where we had a really unexpected result. And so instead of just discarding it or ignoring that subject, really digging into why was this subject an outlier was a really fruitful endeavor. Also, I think in the context of any kind of predictive model, it can be very tempting to just like develop it on your data and like maybe cross-validate it and then report your amazing results. But we were able to learn a lot more about how our model would perform well and where it would not perform well by really trying to push it to the limits with data from the real world, data from different labs, different devices, really trying to stretch it and see where it breaks. And lastly, in doing so, we were hugely aided by both open source code and open access data from other researchers. So to whatever extent you can contribute to that, I think you're making science better for everybody. To that end, the code that we used to develop the Carl classifier is available on my GitHub, and the data that we used both to develop it and to validate it is available on Figshare. The README on this page has a link to the Figshare where you can download the data yourself. So I hope maybe some of you can find this useful for your projects, or maybe get inspiration for new and exciting things to do with wearable technology. I really appreciate the time to be here and chat with you, and I look forward to hearing the questions that you have.
That's awesome. Cool. Very cool. Well, thank you so much for the talk. And as you said, we can definitely have time for questions and stuff. So if anybody's got some, feel free to jump in, or if you'd rather me read off a question, feel free to put it in the chat and I will ask John the question. Danny, you want to go first?
Sure. I noticed Jenny unmuted as well. So if you want to go, Jenny, you can, or I'll go.
No, go for it.
Okay. Thanks, John. That was an awesome talk. Really cool method that you've developed. I was curious. I guess it's a two-part question. One, when a researcher is interested in analyzing, like, I don't know, I want to track this for a cross-country team or something over a season. If you have runners that are wearing a GPS watch, how, I guess, I don't know how to word it, but how bad are participants typically in recording their own runs? Like, how much do you end up missing because a participant isn't recording it? Like, is that a substantial issue, I guess, is the first question.
Yeah, when we've done real world research with any kind of device or any kind of thing that requires people to like operate it, I think we get like maybe like 10 to 20% of the time we don't get we miss it. Some of that is not just they like forget to use the watch, but it's like it has a Bluetooth issue with their phone, or they forget it. That's another common thing. So the solution we've been using now is we try to have like multiple layers, and so one thing we've done, for example, is we have like an actigraph, like a research grade device. We also have them have like a foot pod or a GPS watch, and they have a daily survey. So even if we don't get like the like research grade data we want, we still have some idea, did they go running or not? Now, the fact that actigraphs don't have an off switch is, I think, an intentional choice. It's very useful that people can't turn them off because they would forget to turn them back on. But yeah, just a participant error or participant burden is definitely something that you got to watch out for with these kind of studies.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. Just kind of relating to that, do you think that that then moving forward, or at least in the short term, do you see this as more applicable for future studies? Like, okay, I'm developing a study and I'm going to implement this method, or more applicable, and maybe it's evenly applicable, but more applicable for like analyzing past data sets. So like something that isn't really interested in running necessarily, but have, like you said, 1 million participants or something. Do you think it would be more beneficial for analyzing other people's data, or for like designing your
I am
study?
actually more interested in the retrospective use, because there's a lot of big data sets sitting around that people didn't necessarily intentionally collect for looking at running or for looking at different types of exercise. The UK Biobank is one example. The other one, is anybody familiar with NHANES? In the US, it's like a cross-sectional study of about 6,000 people. They do it every year, every other year. And starting in, I think, 2011, they started having people wear actigraphs on the wrist for like 7 days, I think. And if you could identify like everybody who ran in that cohort, or everybody who runs in the UK Biobank study, all of a sudden you have a really interesting cohort, because there are lots of other outcomes, like health outcomes, or like blood lipid levels, cholesterol, like insulin sensitivity. These big cohort studies collect huge amounts of other outcomes that are of interest. I think if you're designing a study, sometimes you can be clever and be like, okay, we'll have them use GPS watches, and then we'll use so some of the papers that have come out of the groups at Calgary have basically done like, they use the GPS watch timestamps to directly grab the accelerometer data. But like for us, we had a ton of accelerometer data that we couldn't really analyze unless we could identify where the running was. So it's actually the retrospective stuff that I'm most interested in.
Gotcha. Awesome. Thank you.
Oh yeah, I had a question. So this was making me think a lot about, if I'm out, taking a quick walk to campus or something, my Apple Watch will pop up and say like, are you on an outdoor walk?
Mm-hmm.
So I guess I was curious, kind of thinking about how subject specific data could like further refine your classifiers in terms of when you were kind of looking at edge cases that broke the classifier. Was it often, I guess, completely separate activities, or were there maybe single strides or in those transitions where you could benefit from, getting a little bit of validation from, let's say, a brand new user who was going to use this to kind of further refine the bounds of how you were drawing, the divisions between your classes a little bit more on a subject independent basis or dependent basis?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And the biggest challenge generally is generalizing to new people. If you're trying to make a classifier that like identifies activities for a specific person, it tends to be pretty easy if you can get them into the lab and then train them, like, or record data on like them doing whatever activity it is. People's movement patterns are very idiosyncratic, and it tends to be pretty easy to do that. And I think there are, like, especially for rare circumstances or like rare kinds of activities, like maybe like if you're trying to detect when somebody with a prosthetic limb stumbles, that might be a good example. You bring them into the lab, record how they walk, intentionally trip them a few times, and then build a subject specific model. So I think there is room for that when you're looking at these rare things. But of course, for me, like what I'm always trying to do is like scale up to scales that would be impossible to bring. I'm not going to be able to bring 1,000 people into my lab.
Could you make like fake people? I don't know. This is something that I'm working on a little bit of like, could you hypothesize what people might look like and just right? Because if it is just on amplitude or frequency, was that person really that active, or are they just the biggest person in your study, right? Because acceleration is going to be dependent on
Right.
that and stuff.
Yeah, there's a cool paper out of, I think it's Ton Vandenbogert's lab, where they were trying to predict joint moments from IMU data, and they basically they used a musculoskeletal model to simulate, like generate synthetic IMU data, where it's like and they like changed and perturbed it.
This is like where they run the open sim backwards, basically.
Yeah. And like backwards inferred, like what's the acceleration and angular velocity at this point. And then if you had a device there, it's in machine learning, there's this idea of data augmentation, where I think it's really similar, where like if you have say chest x-rays, you can like take it and like flip it left, right, or like twist it a little bit or apply like some blurring. And there might be analogous ideas for activity recognition, but it's really hard to take a signal and change it in a way where it would be a reasonable change to make, right? Yeah. So like changing the amplitude maybe wouldn't be so reasonable, because that might change what kind of activity it is.
It might be something interesting if you could get you might not even have to go all the way to like forward modeling, but like if you got, or like Ross Miller uses, right, this average curve, this is what walking looks like, and then makes a model walk. If you said this is what running looks like, and then, change the size of the person a bunch, or change the mass distribution on the person.
You might have one thought that just popped into my mind that might work is you might even be able to do like just take video and look at I don't know if anybody's used like Canovia or any of those like video kinematics, but just like take a video of a bunch of people running or using an elliptical machine or a rowing machine or whatever, and then get a rough estimate of what their acceleration at different parts of their body would look like. That might also work. If you got enough people and you twisted and flipped it around enough, that might actually work too.
Cool.
I have a question. Hi, John. Great talk. It was very interesting. And so when you were talking about those kind of edge cases that you were, those outliers that you were seeing and you were trying to test your classifier against, was there any like other like simple attributes of the signal that you were thinking about using? Because when you were showing the elliptical versus running, you can see that the elliptical is very smooth compared to like the running. And so what came to my mind was like, maybe what if you did like a Fourier transform where you got more attributes of the signal and you could distinguish between elliptical and running. Just because you mentioned, some of those outliers, went into the development of this classifier, were there any other features of the signal that you were thinking about as you were creating this classifier?
Yeah, one path we went down that didn't quite didn't end up making it into the final the final algorithm was trying to quantify how bumpy the bump is. Like, does it have one smooth curve or does it have several smaller like intermediary bumps? Because we noticed like the elliptical machine or other things you get on in the gym, like the rowing machine, tend to have a very smooth curve, whereas running, maybe because it's less restricted, you have more smaller bumps in the gait cycle. It turned out though, like pertinent to Jenny's comment, I think it was Jenny who brought this up, people's individual gait pattern is really idiosyncratic. And so some people run in a way that's also like very smooth. And so it turned out that just wasn't that useful. It was basically just degrading our performance without really improving it. I would love to do a follow-up study that was trying to look at lots of different cyclical types of activities, and try to either come up with some more clever features or go the like black box machine learning algorithm and just like really dump it all in. But to do that, you need lots of examples of lots of different types of motions, and the set of like all ways you can move your body is a really big there's a lot of things you can do, right? And there's a lot of things people do for exercise. And every time I walk through our gym here, like I always, since I've done this, I'm always like looking around at how people are moving, and people do some goofy stuff at the gym, like stuff you would just never think of.
Great, thanks.
That's for sure. That's cool. I was just wondering, while we're on the sort of like the crossover cases, did you do any where, right? Because there's that overlapping period where you could be walking and you could be running somewhere in that transition. Did you do any where they ran slower than a walking case, or they met that speed this by doing different activities?
Yeah, so there were those speeds close to the walk run transition were actually presented in random orders. And there were a couple people who would have a walking speed that was faster than a running speed. But we didn't, I thought about and chose not to tell people how to move, because I could have collected like, I want you to intentionally run at 1.5 meters per second. But it felt like that would be kind of like putting my finger on the scale to make them move in a way that they wouldn't normally choose to move.
Yeah, we're doing a VO2 with speed against speed study over ground right now. So that was just something we were thinking about a lot, because some people, if your preferred walking speed is fast enough, if we try to tell you to go to 130%, you would never actually stay walking at that speed. And so we're forcing it intentionally. But then it's interesting that you said it's sometimes above and sometimes, because it does seem to be, there's something about the harmonic that you're in. So at some speeds it could be faster, but you still want to walk.
Right.
And then,
yeah. I'm actually having a similar issue right now with some data collections with running, where I have people doing like 30% slower than their typical run pace. And for some people, 30% slower than an already pretty slow pace is like, very slow. So it can be tricky with like pushing people into speeds where like they would actually prefer a different gait pattern.
Trying to get them to walk at 50% of their preferred walking speed, especially if their preferred walking speed was slow that day. It's like, no, we really need it not to beat bad shoe. It's even slower than that. Because we're trying to do it over ground to take the treadmill. And it's one of those, like, I'd never done a big VO2 study before this. And so it's like, I see why everybody does them on a treadmill. That makes perfect sense to me now.
Yeah. Are you doing it on like a track with
the room is like big enough to have them walk in an oval. We were looking at we just got the first like 3 people in, right, figuring it out. And so we had, some of them are undergrads. So we're like, yeah, you're going to do another hour. It's fine. Your legs work great. And we're trying to see if we see a difference if we can pick up a difference between them going in an oval and them getting to the end of the room and turning around. Because like going around the turn, you actually change speed a lot more for a lot longer.
Yeah.
Even if we make that bigger and bigger than you do if you just spin and come back. But other people have shown before that you could like pick that up on the VO2. And we're like, you're turned around and going back at pace by the, 3 seconds have gone by of the VO2 collection. So it's interesting. We probably should make a couple more people do it, but especially if you started adding a device in there, because part of it is like, well, how do you use these devices? And you're not going to get a kid with CP to walk around continuously for 5 minutes. So like, can we get them to go back and forth where we help spin them around? Will that not really change what we're seeing? So some of them are questions like that, but that's cool. I was definitely thinking one of the other things you could use to pick up is we're trying to look at like, can you get the gait cycle from how they load a external device?
Like a walker or something.
Yeah.
Specifically
a walker in my case, but you could do it with other devices.
What was really cool about that step segmentation thing is it works for like any cyclical thing. So you can do it for like the rowing machine, you can do it for riding a bicycle. Anything where like you are going through a periodic motion with your body that gets picked up with like reasonable signal to noise. So that was really cool. That was one of the nice byproducts of like taking the actographs and going and trying out every elliptical machine at the gym, is that like even like the Versa climber or like all the goofy machines, there is like a gait cycle to them. as long as it's periodic enough.
I had one more question that you can talk as much about it or as little about it as you want, but I was just curious. I think you mentioned when you were answering Luis's question, what didn't work? I mean, we often just talk about what did work, but I was curious if there was, with developing methods papers, it seems like you try 50 things and then finally something works and you're like, aha, I've settled on it. I was just curious if there were certain things that maybe that you really learned from that didn't work, or, if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, when I first started doing this, I read a ton of these human activity recognition papers that were out of like computer science conferences. And their mode of doing this kind of work is like you get a data set of a modest number of people doing a lot of different exercises, like different activities, like oddly specific things. So like some of these data sets would have like eating potato chips, eating soup, going upstairs slowly, going upstairs quickly, and kind of treating them all as like equally things you should try to classify with like equal precision. And a lot of these papers were messing around with all these different kinds of like features of like time domain, frequency domain, like entropy, complexity type features, and like lots of really sophisticated algorithms. So like decision trees or random forests or support vector machines. And I went like way down that rabbit hole. I was trying like all these like crazy variables and features to try to like really describe a lot of different aspects of the accelerometer signal, and it was performing well. But Martin, especially the postdoc I was working with, pointed out like, hey, maybe we can do just as good or almost as good with something that's really, really, really simple and easy to understand. Because when your algorithm that uses like, 15 coefficients from the discrete cosine transform doesn't work, it's like, I don't know why it didn't work. So yeah, that was probably the biggest thing the biggest like dead end for me was really going deep on the way the computer science way of doing human activity recognition without taking a step back and thinking like, okay, first principles, let's try something really simple and dumb. Another thing that didn't work or that we moved away from was just using the Fourier transform, and the reason for the frequency. And the reason we moved away from that is you need relatively long signal to get high frequency resolution. But with the wavelet transform, you can trade a little bit of amplitude resolution for better frequency resolution in shorter samples. So it seems like kind of an odd choice to like just come up with wavelets out of nowhere, but that came out of the Fourier transform being kind of like not having enough frequency resolution to really delineate the especially like fast walk, slow run. So that was another dead end that didn't work so well.
Sure. Awesome. Thank you.
I like that explanation of not using black boxes. We definitely, me and my lab mate, I think, annoyed, but in maybe a positive way, and then just intrigued our informatics professor one semester, because we were like, it wasn't he did a lot with the material scientists, but biomechanics was new, and they're like, no, I can give you 200 parameters, one step. They moved a meter and a third or something. He's like, what? We're like, yeah, would you like the single data points? Would you like it as a curve that's been split into 100 data points? And so it was interesting to hear a lot of those and how they do it. And I like some of them. Some of the black box, I totally agree that like, what do you do with that? And like in computer science, they have different goals. So you could, but like for us, it's like, well, we need to be able to read it at the end.
Yeah. I think there are problems in biomechanics that are best approached with really sophisticated black box algorithms, especially when you have like really noisy, difficult to process input and an output that's like related to the inputs only through really nonlinear processes. But I think sometimes, especially because machine learning is all the rage right now, it can be tempting to just like come in with that and really like use that hammer on every nail you see without really thinking about like, hey, maybe I should like understand what this algorithm is doing, or see or just have like a baseline where you compare your like really fancy thing to just like a dumb, really simple baseline.
Because that would probably be, and my knowledge of the black box is just enough to be dangerous. But like, right,
Right.
it would, as I understand it, in the ones that I've had to deal with, it would be computationally less expensive to do the simple one. So if you're 99% there with the simple one, or even 90% there in the world of informatics, right? I mean, it depends on what you care about and whether you're, is this an EMT is using this to make decisions, or like somebody else is there, the pilot's still going to fly the plane. And so like, if you're that far with 2 variables, why deal with the rest of it? It's because that makes you faster to put it on a smaller chip or extend your battery life, or right. And so I think that's, yeah, I think we like to use the fanciest, coolest thing, right? It's the fanciest, coolest thing.
Yeah. And computational speed was a big motivator for us, not necessarily because we're trying to like put it on a device, but because we just had a ton of data. I ran a bunch of data we had through this algorithm, and it ended up being something like 1,800 days worth of like accelerometer data to put. But it's like, you got like 30 people, and then times 7 days a week times however many weeks, and you end up with like just a colossal amount of data, and so you need to be able to like run through it really quick.
That's awesome. I wonder if you could even get to the point where it was like something you could clip on, like a running bib or something. And so just like every local, like you knew you don't know exactly when they're running, but like given 3 hours or something, sort of when they're running. And then could you work with some race to like, here's a 10 miler, here's the Boston Marathon. Like, I think that'd be really cool.
Yeah. There's a couple papers that do some cool stuff with like putting basically like in people's like the packet they give them for the race. They're like, hey, put this on your shoe or put this on your shin and wear it for the whole race. But even there, like, people stop, they like use the bathroom, or they stop at a water stop, and getting when were they actually running out?
I think that would be awesome to get actually running out of that. Yeah. And even I feel like there was one, I feel like it must have been Boston, but maybe it wasn't, that they did one and it was still like you were saying about the human participant. It was still like, we did very explicit instructions. Like we like tested it on a bunch of different people to make sure they all put it on right. And then like 1/10 of the people put it on upside down or something. And so then you need another algorithm that like step 1, check if they put it on upside down.
Yes. Yeah. So trusting people when they go out in the real world is like, it's very tricky.
Trust but verify.
Yes.
I have one more question that I guess was kind of on machine learning may be the answer to this. I'm not sure if you have any thoughts, but I've seen some stuff recently where people are putting accelerometers on shoes and they're able to extrapolate things like step length or step width or step clearance. Do you think there's a possibility of getting at some of those more like granular metrics with accelerometers that are mounted a little bit more proximally to the feet? And do you think, I guess with your current approach, you probably wouldn't be able to, combine X, Y, Z if you wanted to get some of those spatial metrics? So just curious if you thought about ways that you could do that with the sensors that you have.
Yeah, I think, no, actually so I can get like stride duration already just by chopping it up. I think there are algorithms out there to get ground contact time from center mass acceleration. There's a nice paper out of Colorado on using the raw accelerometer data to get ground reaction forces, like the full ground reaction force curve, which is pretty cool. The only limitation with some things like ground contact time being a good example is actually the sampling frequency of the device. Like 100 hertz sounds like a lot, but one step is only a third of a second, and that includes, and only 60% of that time is actually on the ground. And so you only have like 25 or so samples of data, and trying to go from that to like how long were they on the ground, you have, I think, more uncertainty. But I am really excited about the prospect of getting more granular biomechanical information from wearable devices. And I'll be presenting an abstract on that at National North American Congress on Biomechanics this summer. So come check it out.
Sweet. We'll look
I
for
think
you
that
for
I'm even
sure.
in a session on wearable devices. So
Sweet. Yeah.
I'm really excited about the possibilities. And broadly, there's like two strategies for doing that. There's like what people do with IMUs. If you have the magnetometer, the angular velocity, and the accelerometer, you can like explicitly integrate it over time, like do a double integral to get displacement. That's one strategy, is kind of like that avenue. And then another strategy is like the machine learning stuff, and just treat it as like input, output, and I'm going to stick a model in the middle. So I am super excited about that prospect.
So you said you're using the resultant of the acceleration trajectory right now. If you then decided when they were running, or you knew when they were running, is it still like lined up enough? You could go back and just look at, okay, if we take the components of that resultant, then you would have, right, the X velocity and stuff that.
Yeah,
right,
it's actually
Jenny,
perfectly lined up. So you just can go right back and get independent XYZ components from it.
Very cool. Very cool. It seems like you found your elegant solution.
Yeah, I hope
awesome. So. Doesn't usually happen. Cool. I'm just gonna stop the recording.